A very good morning to you. We start with breaking news, and it will be exciting news for Manchester United fans. We can tell you that talks are understood to be advancing between Manchester United and PSG over the signing of midfielder Manuel Ugarte. We're told there is a willingness from all parties to get a deal done. One source claims there is a cautious optimism the move can happen before the deadline. A permanent deal is the preference for both United and PSG, but interestingly, a loan with an obligation has also been mooted. So both sides would ideally like a permanent transfer, but potentially it could happen with a loan with an obligation, just moving perhaps some of that fee down the line a little bit. So that is the news we are bringing you this morning to kick off Good Morning Transfers. Talks advancing between Manchester United and PSG over the signing of midfielder Manuel Ugarte. We have got our guests with us, of course, this morning. Good morning to Dan Bardell, Kwaku Afari and Daniel Kahn as well. Let's kick off with that news we brought you then a little bit earlier at the start of the show. Manchester United, they've got a bit of credit, haven't they, so far for their moves in this transfer window. But we're getting towards the end of the window now and they haven't signed a midfielder yet, although we're now seeing talks are advancing. Are you surprised we've got this far into the window and a deal hasn't been done?
Not massively, because they've been concentrating on other areas. It was clear that they needed to reinforce their defence, and they've done that with three defenders coming through the door. I think we talk about certain markets being hard. The midfield market isn't as difficult, and the further on you go through the window, the more opportunities might arise. We saw Manchester United acted quite late in the last summer window, with Amrabat coming in. I think that was actually on deadline day in the last summer window. So I think maybe they're just keeping their options. They've been keeping their options open to see if anything was to come up later on in the window. I think this signing is a good signing. I think he fits their age profile that Ineos are kind of looking at. In Manchester United in the past have signed players over 30. We saw with Casemiro the summer before. Last summer, I think they've just been waiting to see what happens with other potential moves and see what players come available. He's one who's been linked throughout this window, and I think he'd be a good signing, but I don't think it's a massive problem that it's one that's happening later on in the window.
United's problems in midfield were well documented last season, so does Ugarte solve all those issues if he comes in?
I don't know if he solves all of those issues. He fits the profile of what Manchester United are looking for, that physical anchor in midfield that's also pretty progressive on the ball. Tim Vickery joined us last week and described him as a Javier Mascherano regen, in effect, in terms of the way that he plays, the way that he can put in a tackle. He is quite physical, but also when he's on the ball, does look to play passes and can progress it through the final third. If you look at that Mascherano comparison, I always think back to the 2008 season where Liverpool had Mascherano, Alonso and Gerrard in midfield. I think Kobe Mainoo does a lot of what an early Alonso did at Liverpool. And if you look at Gerrard, who's playing behind Fernando Torres, that kind of Bruno Fernandes position behind the striker. I think he fits the midfield quite well and balances it out in terms of what Manchester United are looking for. We know about the physical decline of Casemiro, obviously once a great centre midfielder, but not what he used to be. And so I feel like Ugarte can fill that void, especially with the age profile as well, 23 years old. It fits in line with what Manchester United have been doing in this transfer window, going for young, exciting players have got upside as opposed to previously going for more experienced older players that haven't got great sell-on value. So I think this deal works for both sides. In terms of what Ugarte brings to Manchester United midfield, it's that physicality which they've lacked for the last 3 or 4 seasons.
I think the big thing with Ugarte is, I think if you were to go through Manchester United's central midfield options, I think he's the perfect partner for any of them. So you can put him next to any of Manchester United's midfielders, and I think that partnership works. Whereas at the moment, when you put, say, Mainoo and Casemiro or Mainoo and McTominay, I don't think the combinations are quite right in there. We've seen Manchester United in the past be too easy to play through. I think he solves that problem because I think he works with each of the midfielders that they have.
Yeah, we're talking about him perhaps being almost a replacement or a like-for-like kind of player for Casemiro. So what happens to him now, Dan?
I think we've seen through this window, as you mentioned, I think we've over the window seen perhaps a little bit of interest from Saudi Arabia for Casemiro, but that interest hasn't been followed up. And I think actually, you mentioned a potential replacement for Casemiro and Ugarte, but I think actually it gives Erik ten Hag a lot more flexibility in midfield, because I think You mentioned Mainu next to Casemiro at the moment. I think last season we saw in quite a few games, depending on the opposition, United were caught out in transition quite a lot, where Casemiro was the lone body in midfield and he was outnumbered quite a lot. So I think actually having another player who can act as a six, even next to Casemiro, in certain occasions, in certain matches, maybe just gives that defence a bit more protection, because I think United is still looking at that back four as well, which they now need a settled back four now with Dalit Mazraoui and hopefully Lisandro Martinez back fit. So I think actually, rather than looking at it as a straight replacement for Casemiro, that might be for more next season. But I think for this season, it's actually more options, and it gives them kind of more different tactics to approach different games, I think.
In the first game against Fulham on Friday night, Manchester United's midfield still looked porous. And with the thing about last season as well, the first game of the season against Wolves, the midfield looked porous. So I think that's the biggest issue. And I think adding an extra body in Ugarte, who's got more legs than, say, Casemiro, definitely solves that issue. Because that's been their biggest problem. That's the problem for a lot of these teams in the Premier League, sorting out that engine room. And options kind of alleviates that issue. And I think that Ugarte combined with Casemiro or combined with Kobbie Mainoo, like you said, Dan, gives them multiple options in that position.
So we think that Casemiro and Ugarte can play together. I feel like that might not be the best option for build-up for Manchester. It feels like it's putting a lot of responsibility on other players.
He's good on the ball, though, isn't he, Ugarte? He's got European pedigree. He's played in Portugal. He's played in France. He's played in European competitions as well. I think what Kwaku said is true. He'll bring that little bit of bite, but that doesn't mean just because he's a defensive midfielder that he isn't good on the ball. And actually, if you look back to Casemiro's first season, I know he's seen as a defensive midfielder, but he's actually been better for Manchester United when he himself has been allowed to go forward. He scored a lot of important goals in that first season he was there. Manchester United had a really good season that season. They won the Carabao Cup. I think they finished third in the league. Maybe last season with the midfield options, Casemiro was forced to be that defensive man, and sometimes that lone defensive man, which at this stage of his career he didn't handle brilliantly. I think freeing him up a little bit, I think he's a better player than he gets credit for, and when he's allowed to go forward, I think that suits him more now than having to sit in and be that lone anchor.
Interesting. We are expecting United to let go of some players over the coming hours and days, including Facundo Pellistri, as well as Hannibal Mejri possibly as well. So just to recap what we brought you at the top of the programme here on Good Morning Transfers, talks advancing between Manchester United and PSG over the signing of Manuel Ugarte, a willingness from all parties to get that deal done. Permanent deal is the preference. A loan with an obligation has also been talked about as well. Any more on that, we will bring it to you as the show progresses.